Have you ever felt torn between working day shift and working night shift? Have you tried them both? I have a very personal story about this issue that I'll share during this episode. So let's talk about the ups and downs and ins and outs of day shift versus night shift, right here on episode 177 of The Nurse Keith Show. Well, hello and welcome to the Nurse Keith Show. I am so grateful that you're listening, whether it's your first time tuning in or you've been hanging out with me here on the podcast airwaves for months or years. Thank you for being part of the growing Nurse Keith Nation. This podcast is all about you and your nursing career, and I'm here to share education, inspiration, and ideas that can get you moving in a positive and inspired direction. If you want to see the show notes for this episode, hop on over to nursekeith.com/the word episode and the number 177. This episode of the Nurse Keith Show is brought to you by Janu Scrubs. That is JAANUU. They do not compromise quality, fit, or style. I love my Janus, and you can get 25% off any order by visiting bit.ly/Nurse Keith Scrubs. That's bit.ly/Nurse Keith Scrubs. Use the code NurseKeith25 at checkout for 25% off. Anyway, I am thrilled you're here, so let's dig right into today's topic. Back on September 24th, 2018, I published a blog post about day shift versus night shift because, this is an ongoing dilemma for nurses, and I bet it dates back to the days of Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War. What do you think? So there were hundreds, maybe thousands, well, probably hundreds, I don't want to get too hyperbolic here, of injured and dying and hurt soldiers that Florence and her nurses needed to take care of. And I bet some of them worked days and some of them worked nights. And I wonder back then if they had some of the same conversations about day shift versus night shift as we do now. I know life was very different in the 19th century, but this has been an issue that has been with us nurses as long as there have been nurses. And I receive a lot of questions from you, from people out there who are trying to decide between days and nights, who are working nights and want to switch to days, people who are working days and are thinking of switching to nights. And a lot of people reach out to me because they're not sure if it's a good decision to go from one to the other. So the age-old question is, do I work nights and get the differential and ruin my social life for the most part? Do I work days and run my tail off every single day with the residents and the doctors and the surgeons and the nurse practitioners and everybody bugging me for everything all day and every day? I said at the top of the episode that I was going to tell you a personal story about this, and I'll share that back before I was a nurse, I worked with the developmentally disabled population, mostly in group homes. And I ended up doing a lot of awake and also asleep overnights throughout nursing school and even before I was in nursing school when I was working in that particular milieu. And I loved that work. And I think it was hard on my wife and my then school-age son that I often had to leave and I would be gone all night and often come back exhausted because I had worked an awake overnight. So when I told my wife that I was 100% sure that I was going to become a nurse, she said to me that I could absolutely become a nurse. She would support me through school. She would support me in my career, but I could never, ever work nights again. So I made her a promise before starting nursing school that I would never work nights. And you know what? It's been 22 years and I have never, ever worked a night shift since I made her that promise back in 1994 or so when I started school. Well, I bet you might have a story around day shift versus night shift, or maybe someone you know. Yeah, maybe one of your colleagues or friends is really struggling with that. It is the nursing conundrum that never gets old. So let's dive into working days and talk about some of the ups and downs and ins and outs of days. And then we will move on to the opposite part of the clock after the break. So when working in hospitals, lots and lots of nurses are needed for both day shift and night shift. Day shift is, as most people know, the time when most of the stuff that needs to happen with patients is happening. So surgeries happen during the day, unless they are emergency surgeries that are usually transferred from the ER. So surgeries happen, MRIs, CAT scans, all that kind of stuff happens. If you are working in a teaching facility, a teaching hospital, then you're going to have residents, interns, medical students, maybe nursing students too. And then you have your physicians and surgeons and physician assistants and nurse practitioners and clinical nurse specialists, all these people making their rounds. So day shift on a busy telemetry or med-surg or CCU, it is going to be pretty busy. You're going to be getting orders up the wazoo all the time. Things are changing. Things are shifting. It's like you're working your butt off and you're running on shifting sands, and you never know how fast and furious it's going to get at any given moment. This is not to cast aspersions on night shift. We will talk about all the stuff that happens on night shift, but days is when it is pretty chaotic, and you can often count on it being chaotic. So day shift can be intense in assisted living. It could be intense in a SNF, in a nursing home. Depends where you are and what you're doing, but days is usually when there's a lot more action. And it can be a difficult place if you are, one, kind of on the slower side and you like to move a little slower and have more time for conversation, etc. Days can be a little bit of a challenge. You also have patients being delivered their meals. There's a lot more happening around you that's non-clinical as well. That can definitely be a shift that works really well for some people and works terribly for other people. So first, let's talk about some of the pros of day shift. And I'm sure I'm not going to get to them all. You may have a pro that you love about day shift, and I would love to hear from you. So feel free to email me at keith@nursekeith.com or respond to any of our tweets or Instagram or Facebook posts about this episode and let us know what you love about day shift and or night shift. So the first thing I think of when I think of days in terms of a pro, in terms of an advantage, is sleep. We humans are generally wired to sleep at night when it's dark. Period. That is just a physiological and developmental fact. Working days lets you honor your own circadian rhythms and sleep like everybody else in the world. Your partner or spouse might appreciate that you're around to cuddle with them and keep the bed warm in winter. So sleep is definitely something that day nurses probably don't have as much of an issue with than their nighttime counterparts. The second advantage is learning. You can learn on night shift, of course, but what I hear from a lot of my clients and the nurses I chat with is that because so much stuff is happening during the day, you have a lot of chance for off-the-cuff conversations with a surgeon or a doc or a clinical nurse specialist. You might have grand rounds or other types of rounds happening. There are physicians and other people to chat with. There's just more people around. So there's more opportunities for learning. A lot of stuff might happen at the bedside regularly on days that only happens rarely or once in a blue moon on nights. So learning is definitely really, I think, more robust on days in general. And of course, these are all generalizations, and you can disabuse me of that opinion if you like. Another thing that I think is an advantage of day shift is teamwork. Since there's more people around, you have more practice interfacing with all different sorts of people, including your patients and their families. That's part of the team too. So teamwork is another advantage that I think is important on day shift. Another one, because it's so busy and there's so many people around, you are in on the action. Everything's happening. There's lots of surprises. You can keep track of your patients from day to day if you work contiguous days. And this can help you to see the hours flying by as you're involved in all the action that's happening on the unit. And like I said, families are around. You can talk with your patients more. Some nurses really like days because they can really dig in and form relationships with patients and with their families. Whereas at night, it's not quite as possible and robust because generally people aren't around. Another advantage of days is food. During night shift, cafeterias are usually closed unless your facility happens to have a cafeteria that stays open or has a skeleton crew for the night shift. So during the day, you have access to, hopefully, and you have time for a warm meal if you can manage to get a break. And day shift can be easier for people who aren't quite as good at bringing food from home because the cafeteria is open and you can get yourself fed. The last advantage that I see and that I've heard about is going out with your colleagues after work. When you get off of night shift, you're probably too exhausted to go out, but maybe you go out for breakfast once in a while with your night shift friends. But day shift, you might get out at 3 o'clock or 3:30 or 4 and maybe go out for a beer or go out for a snack before you head home to the kids. So going out after work and hanging out with your colleagues is a little bit more possible on day shift, but maybe that's not even important to you. Now, there are disadvantages to day shift. What I often hear about from clients is this thing about their children, missed opportunities. So if you have kids, especially school age, little kids, and you're working 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., you're leaving the house early in the morning, probably when the kids are barely out of bed yet, or maybe they're still asleep. And then you're getting home well after 7 p.m. Maybe they've already eaten dinner. Maybe they're even in bed if they're little kids. So you miss out on a lot, especially working 7 to 7. If you work 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., you can get home and be there for the kids after school, feed them dinner, help them with their homework. So this thing around kids can be very complicated when we look at day shift versus night shift. In terms of getting stuff done in your life, if you're working 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., and let's say you're single, it can be really difficult to get your car to the garage to get it worked on because you're working 7 to 7 every day and you can never get there. Or say you want to go to counseling or psychotherapy and they only have sessions for you during the day. It can be very, very difficult to arrange. So getting stuff done, like even getting regular errands done during business hours, can be super difficult unless you have a day off during the week, which I recommend having if you work day shift. Now, another one of the disadvantages or cons of day shift that clients have shared with me is the relative chaos of days. Like I said earlier in the episode, you have a lot of people around and a lot of things happening during day shift, which can be great. Don't get me wrong. It can be great for all that learning and conversation and connection and networking. I think it's a wonderful thing that can happen on day shift because you're surrounded by people all the time. On the other hand, the flip side of being surrounded by people all the time is that there's so much going on, you can't concentrate. And you get distracted and it's too noisy and there's just too many people around asking you for stuff. So that can cause you to feel like, I would rather work nights when there's nobody around and it's pretty quiet and I can just listen to the hum of the crickets and the call bells from my patients. Now, speaking of patients and their families, working during the day, you are subject to having to interface with patients a lot because they're more awake during the day, of course, well, generally, and their families are there. And families can be wonderful, and families can also be very, very difficult and distracting. Hanging out with patients and their families and your colleagues can be great, and it also has a flip side. So if you work days, you know what I'm talking about. And days are a mixed bag, just like nights, and we need to really think clearly about what is best for us. So when we come back from the break, we are going to dive into working night shift. So we will be right back with the second half of episode 177 of The Nurse Keith Show. Well, we're going to take a quick pause for the cause about how you can support The Nurse Keith Show. That's right. You can become a patron of The Nurse Keith Show, just like other listeners who value this show so much that they want to give just a little bit each month to support the work we're doing here. When you pledge, you not only get the satisfaction of helping produce and support the show, you also get some pretty cool premiums from me. So just head over to patreon.com/Nurse Keith. That's patreon.com/Nurse Keith to read all about it. Also, please consider signing up for my newsletter over at nursekeith.com so that you can receive my bi-weekly message to you right to your inbox. And remember to leave a rating and review of The Nurse Keith Show over on Apple Podcasts and iTunes because it really helps other people find the show. So those are my sincere asks of you, dear listener. So now let's get back to The Nurse Keith Show and the subject at hand. And we're back. Hey, thanks for hanging out with me here on The Nurse Keith Show, episode 177. Before the break, we were talking about the pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, ups and downs of working days. Now we're going to talk a little bit about nights. I have spoken with countless nurses who work nights, friends, colleagues, and coaching clients. And some of them they just love night shift. They wouldn't trade it for days for anything. Night shift has kind of a mystique. Night nurses live in a particular type of world, and they are working those graveyard hours just like gasoline station attendants and convenience store clerks and law enforcement officers and first responders and firefighters, and even people working in factories and hotels. Lots and lots of professionals, paraprofessionals, and non-professionals work at night while the rest of us are cozily in our beds. We should be grateful to them for doing it because somebody has to, because the hospital is never ever closed. And there are pros and cons to working night shift. So let's dive right into the pros. So the things that drive some people absolutely bonkers and around the bend about day shift might be the same reasons why some people just adore working at night. One of the main things I hear from people who work nights and love it is that they love the autonomy, the independence, and the quiet. There's very few patients' families around. There are not really any visitors to speak of, and there's not a lot of other providers and colleagues running around. So there's fewer distractions, and it's a nice, quiet space in which to work. I was recently speaking with a client who was thinking of leaving night shift, but she was very reluctant to give up the differential. Night shift salaries tend to be slightly higher than day shift salaries because they have to pay you to work nights, right? I mean, there's a lot of sacrifice involved. And the differentials, the shift differentials, can be pretty decent. If you become financially or emotionally dependent on that differential, on earning that much more money for night shift, it might get really difficult for you to shift to days. It might really feel like a hardship to give up that extra $4 or $5 an hour. So that is definitely an issue for lots of people who I speak with. Another advantage of working night shift is getting off work at, let's say, 7 a.m., like most of you do, or hopefully by 7:30 for sure once you finish your documentation and report. And you can actually get a couple errands done on the way home, and you can make it home to get the kids off to school. That can be a really cool thing. You've lost some sleep, of course, because you've been working all night, and maybe getting the kids off to school or doing errands, or man, if you have a sick kid at home, you can't even go to sleep if your spouse is on his or her way to work once you get home. So it can be difficult, but getting stuff done on your way home from work and being home for the kids after school when you wake up can also be a great advantage of night shift. Now, a lot of nurses like night shift because driving into work, if you're commuting in a busy metropolitan area, driving into work is a breeze generally at 6:30 p.m. because you're going against traffic. It's often a reverse commute for most of you, I hope. Some of you might be caught in terrible rush hour traffic. And when you get off work in the morning, you can actually get stuck in some traffic, but it all depends on when you get there and when you get off. Night shift people often love that the parking lots are empty, so it's easy to find a parking place. These might seem like small things, but these are some of the things that people really love about nights. Now, I mentioned kids earlier. Having time with your kids, let's say getting home at 7:30 or 7:45 a.m., getting them off to school, that can be a really big plus for busy families. And it also can be lovely that you're home when they get home from school around 3:30 or 4. So night shift nurses can often be more present for the families during the week than those who are stuck working days. Finally, a lot of people talk about the quiet environment gives them time to think, that there's a lot of space, there's a lot of open time, downtime at night. This can seem a little boring sometimes, but it allows you the breadth of space to maybe do some writing or do some studying or chat with your colleagues and maybe take some CEU courses online in between patient calls when the call bells go off. So nights can have lots of advantages, and there are disadvantages too. One of the disadvantages of nights, and here we move into the negative realm, is that it could cause you some marital or relationship issues. So let's say you work 3 to 4 nights a week. That's 3 or 4 nights that your intimate partner doesn't have you in bed with them. This can cause some problems for your sexual intimacy, your sexual physical relationship, which can be dealt with creatively. And it can also just be that you're less connected with your spouse because you're like ships passing in the night. You're not spending the nights together. You're not having all those rituals that other couples have. So that can be a little difficult for some couples to overcome. My wife knew that was an issue for us. So she was like, well, when you become a nurse, you are never working nights ever again. So she set down the law, put her foot down, and I said, yes, dear, and have never worked nights since, like I said. Now, another disadvantage of nights is social life. When you work nights, especially if you're working, let's say, a Friday night and a Saturday night, you can miss out on a lot of fun in your social circles. Your friends invite you to dinner and you're like, well, sorry, I've got to be at work at 6:45, or they invite you out to a play or a concert and you can't go. And when you're working at that time on weekends, on the nights when everyone has plans, you're going to miss parties. You might miss weddings. A lot of my night shift nurses complain that they've missed weddings. They've missed all sorts of things because they were working nights. And some just feel disconnected from their social circles. And that is a real problem for them. And some people switch to days because they just can't take the social isolation. One of the biggest disadvantages to working nights, in my humble opinion, is the shift work disorder, the health issues and symptoms that can arise when you're having problems. The National Sleep Foundation did name it shift work disorder for a reason. Factory workers, firefighters, law enforcement, healthcare professionals, all the people who work overnight shifts have this issue, or many have this issue. Some people have a hard time sleeping during the day. They have to take sleep aids, they have to buy blackout curtains, and sometimes they even still have trouble sleeping when the sun is out. So those circadian rhythms can really get messed around with, and it can affect you in many ways. Working night shift has been shown to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, mood and anxiety disorders, gastrointestinal issues, and many, many more. So if you're having physical symptoms from working nights, you might find at a certain point you need to switch to days because you just can't take it anymore. Meanwhile, make sure you take the supplements that your medical provider or other provider recommends for combating the fatigue and the difficulty of night shift. Make sure you stay very well hydrated. Make sure you take whatever supplements are going to get you through and work against these negative side effects so that it doesn't take a toll on your health over time. One thing that night nurses often complain about is that time goes by so slowly that night shift can sometimes feel a little dry, a little boring because there's not much going on, and you can get really sleepy and really feel the tedium and the ticking of the clock because just not that much is happening. You can busy yourself with stuff, but around 3 a.m., 4 a.m., it gets really hard to stay awake and stay on task. So that can be quite difficult as well. Now, a little while ago, I mentioned connecting with patients and their families when you work days. This is something that some of the nurses I've spoken with complain about who work nights. They feel disconnected. They feel like they're not getting to know their patients because the patients are sleeping most of the night, and they're just basically going in and waking them up to take vitals and give them their medications and respond to call bells and IV alarms and that sort of thing. So that nurse-patient bond and the nurse's bond with the family members can't really happen at night for the most part. And that can be a real loss for nurses who are very relationally oriented. Making the choice between days and nights is never set in stone. You can always change from one to the other unless you're married to someone like my wife, Mary, and then you'll never ever change because you want to keep her happy. If you're new to nursing, you might want to try both. Nights is sometimes better for new grads who feel a little low confidence because they can kind of get started slowly and not get too crazy during the chaos of a day shift until they have some time under the belt as new nurses. Some night shift nurses, like I said, get dependent on the money. That can be a factor that makes it hard to give up. However, when you're feeling the ill effects of night shift and you're experiencing those symptoms, that could really turn the page for you and make you realize that, yeah, I got to switch to days now. If you like nightlife and partying and going out with your friends, it is also going to be a little difficult to keep that going if you work many nights a week. One thing I don't recommend is switching from days to nights every week. Some people do that because they think they get the best of both worlds, but it makes it even more difficult for your body to adjust. So be careful when you make commitments like that because it can be difficult to go back. Check out night shift, check out day shift, check them both, see what works for you, especially if you're a new nurse. And remember, you can always change if it seems that one is definitely not working for you like it would have. So in the final analysis, we need nurses who work days and we need nurses who work nights. And luckily, there's always people willing to fulfill all of those positions. Both have their ups and downs. Every nurse has to find a work schedule and a work style that fits with their chosen lifestyle. So whatever your lifestyle is, create a work style and a work pattern that works for you and doesn't hobble the parts of your life that really hold interest for you and are the things that you really love to do. And as your life changes over time, you have children, you get married, things change, you get older, make sure you're aware that you can always alter the way that you work in order to meet the demands of your family, your home life, and your own physical body and psycho-emotional needs. You're not married to your work-related choices forever. Make the best choice you can for now, and then come back around and revisit again when you need to. And you can always reach out to old Nurse Keith if you need some advice. So there you have it, folks. Thanks for listening to episode 177 of the Nurse Keith Show. I can't believe we haven't dug into this day shift, night shift thing before. I'm so glad we're finally covering it. And I hope you feel uplifted and empowered from this episode. And I want you to take inspired action every day in the interest of your professional satisfaction and career development. The Nurse Keith Show is edited and produced by Tim Hollowell of thepodcastinggroup.com and his wonderful team, and social media and promotion are handled by the equally wonderful Mark Cappy Speeson. Check out my new podcast, Mastering Nursing. It's an interview-style podcast that will inspire, inform, and uplift you. Check it out at nursingdegreedatabase.com/podcast. Stay positive, care for yourself and others, take inspired action in the interest of your career, and tune in again and again and again as we explore how to take your life and career to the next level. Be well, dig deep, seek joy, and keep in touch. And adios till next time from beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is Nurse Keith, and I am out, and I will see you next time.